China, the country poised to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy and trigger a radical change in the world order, could have a very different economic reality than the one officially presented, allowing the United States to maintain its supremacy for much longer and leave behind the idea that China will lead the world, as happened with Japan a couple of decades ago. The Chinese economy could be only 40% of what the official figures indicate. At least that is the conclusion that can be reached with the results of the research published in the prestigious Journal of Political Economy by the Doctor of Economics and Professor at the University of Chicago, Luis Martínez. After decades of remarkable growth, there were fewer and fewer economists, analysts, and investors who were skeptical that China could surpass the United States as the world's largest economy, but with this small group having a strong reason to remain skeptical. Their lack of confidence in the figures released by the Chinese government, an idea that is now backed by data, thanks to research like Martínez's. But before looking at this research, it's helpful to first review some basic economics. GDP, or gross domestic product, is a measure of the size of an economy based on the final goods and services produced in it. One of the ways to calculate GDP is through the expenditure approach, where GDP is the result of adding household consumption, business investment, government spending, exports, and subtracting imports, which are not part of the country's production. Currently, the United States is the country with the highest GDP, by traditional measurements, followed by China, with an economy of around 74% of the United States, and Japan and Germany with only a fraction of the first two, although until recently it was suggested that China could surpass the United States as soon as 2028. Now these estimates have moved to the middle of the next decade or even never, for reasons that I will explain later in the video. But why is something like this important? The GDP is considered the economic indicator par excellence, and both its size and its growth are widely observed by analysts from different areas and used as advertising by political leaders as a way of showing off the achievements reached with the application of their policies.
The numbers for America's economic growth, or GDP, were just released, and I am thrilled to announce that in the second quarter of this year, the United States economy grew at the amazing rate of 4.1%.
Implicitly, it is also assumed that the country with the highest GDP will be the most powerful, its currency will be the reserve currency, and even its culture and form of government will guide the rest of the world. It's no coincidence that you're looking at this on an American platform, on a device probably running US software, and even have investments in US companies or use dollars as a medium of exchange even if you're outside of the US. And internally, GDP growth is often used as a way to show off results and as a political tool for elections, re-elections, and support for projects. But the weight that the world gives to this data led Luis Martínez to ask himself, how much can we trust the dictator's GDP estimates? In other words, how reliable could the official economic data be from an autocratic government, where there is control over the media and the opposition is quickly silenced? And this is obviously a legitimate question. Without an opposition or the free press to question the government, as happens in free countries, what impediment do politicians have to put pressure on the agencies in charge of delivering information on economic growth? What's to stop Putin from saying that the Russian economy is doing better than ever, despite the invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions? Or which media outlet in China is willing to go against Xi Jinping? On the contrary, can you imagine the scandal that traditional media such as CNN would have made if it came to light that Trump pressured the Bureau of Economic Analysis to increase growth, or what Fox News would do if it were Joe Biden who did it? And to try to answer this question, Luis Martínez took an indicator of economic activity that could not be manipulated and that has been used for this type of research, the use of electric lights recorded at night by satellites, and took a sample of 179 countries between 1992 and 2008 to compare the growth in the use of electricity with the official reported GDP growth figures. The finding, which should not surprise anyone, is that when countries grow, so does the record of lights at night. But in countries considered less democratic by different organizations such as Freedom House or Polity 5, reported GDP growth was systematically higher than the observed growth of lights compared to the free countries. And Luis Martínez also found that the government spending and investment components were the most manipulated. Because obviously both exports and imports are more difficult to manipulate, since one country's imports must match the exports reported by others, and its exports must be in line with the imports of others, making them much less practical to manipulate. Reported growth, according to what Martínez found, was on average 35% higher in autocratic countries relative to lights growth compared to more democratic ones. And in the specific case of China, the officially reported growth, which was an average of 6.3% during the period studied, would actually be of the order of 4.9%, according to Martínez. Clarifying that this is a rough estimate, and his research is mainly focused on proving that autocratic governments inflate these figures, but not specifically by how much. But taking these estimates as a reference, Yuri Shasfort, Doctor of Economics and Professor at the Dutch Vrije Universiteit, made an estimate of the size of the Chinese economy. Considering this adjustment and according to his calculations, it would be of the order of 40% of the officially reported. A small difference in annual growth ceases to be small when it accumulates over several decades. And slight changes in the reported numbers have a huge effect, per compound interest, when considered over such a long period of time. And these conclusions are not exclusive of this investigation, and many analysts have questioned the veracity of the official figures provided by China, with many suspicions originating from the government itself, with senior officials such as Li Keqiang admitting in 2010 that the official statistics were problematic and reported GDP was for reference only and secondary to measures such as electricity consumption, rail freight volume, and bank lending. And one of the main causes of this suspicion is that in China growth targets were established for their local governments by the central government, generating an incentive to manipulate the figures. Especially considering that economic researchers in this country have reported that local governors who achieved the goals of growth are promoted within the party, generating a perverse incentive that supports Martínez's conclusions. But what would happen if the geography of autocratic countries, or China specifically, had an incidence on the use of lights, or there was a greater or lesser concentration in cities that distorted the information, or a greater development of certain industries that use more lights in democratic countries? All these and other considerations were made by Martínez to ensure the robustness of the study, with the conclusions standing. In addition, this research has been presented at different seminars, universities, and institutions such as the Central Bank of Chile and the World Bank, and has been published in the renowned Journal of Political Economy, in addition to having been analyzed and cited by dozens of economists. It's not a blog post or Twitter thread. Now let's look at two scenarios. In the first, the results of this investigation are true. What implications would it have for the Chinese economy? On the bright side, it would still be an extremely impressive growth and one of the greatest economic miracles in history. China would remain as the world's second largest economy and a place with the potential to continue to lift people out of poverty and become increasingly prosperous. The negative side is obvious. It would make practically impossible for China to surpass the United States, because its growth, even with official data, has been declining. Furthermore, if China's economy is at about 40% of what it claims to be, then it would be a heavily indebted country, even more so than the United States. On the other hand, it would not pose a major geopolitical threat to the United States, nor would the yuan pose such a threat to the dollar, with the yuan in particular being one of the main factors where China is relegated, since it only represents 2.9% of international reserves currently, while the dollar represents 60% of the international reserves that central banks have. In scenario 2, the results of this investigation are false, or there is a particular explanation for China. Could it still surpass the United States? Before answering, remember to subscribe and share this video if you have found this information useful. In this case, China could be positioned to outperform the United States, as important investors such as Ray Dalio have said. It could also be a great investment opportunity, considering how stagnant its stock market has been, failing to overcome the Great Recession of 2008, while its economy has multiplied by 5, according to official figures. something that another major investor, Charlie Munger, has pointed to as an explanation for his position in companies like Alibaba. However, China faces three big problems that are why more and more analysts are asking whether it can really outperform the United States, even taking official GDP figures for granted.
The worst in the world is China. They've been in the process of updating their data over the course of the last couple of years, and they're now starting to publicly admit that they overcounted by 100 million people. All of those people would have been born since one child, so age 40 and under, the young worker demographic, the childbearing demographic, and 2/3 of them are probably women. So best guess is that China only has 1.3 billion people now. The population probably peaked more than 10 years ago, and by 2030, there will be more retirees than workers, and by 2050, the entire population of China will have dropped below 650 million.
The first is the demographic problem. China's population has stopped growing and its population is aging, which will be a major constraint on growth in the coming years. And as has happened with Japan, it is difficult to solve with immigration due to cultural issues and lack of individual freedom. If there are more older people, more money will go to their livelihood and less to investment. There will be less innovation, entrepreneurship, and greater difficulty in finding workers. The second is the real estate crisis in China, which is of course a very broad topic, but in a simplified way it is due to a real estate bubble that has been bursting, leaving developers bankrupt, people who bought houses without savings and without homes, empty cities with uninhabitable buildings, and a compromised financial system. A version of what happened in the United States, but of a much larger magnitude. And the third is Xi Jinping, who has begun a third term as leader of the country with absolute power that will allow him to continue beyond the third term. Xi Jinping has shown that his desire for power trumps the well-being of his country's people, enforcing so-called zero-COVID policies and continuing with lockdowns nearly a year after most of the world fully reopened from the pandemic. Clearly because his intent is control and not because this is the appropriate method of dealing with COVID. Xi Jinping is also a follower of Mao Zedong, widely considered to be the greatest genocide in history, and has preferred to follow his vision over that of Deng Xiaoping, who is one of those largely responsible for the country's current prosperity thanks to its economic openness and promotion of private initiative that has allowed it to grow.
In his first 5-year terms, it was a massive, what he called an anti-corruption campaign, but it was really a purge of all the competing power centers throughout the party and throughout the system. And whether you had a different view of what China should be or how to get there, you were kicked out. And if you were a local regional power boss, you were brought to heel. In the second 5-year term, Xi went after everyone who agreed with him to make sure that no one was capable of independent thought in his area. And that has made him the most isolated world leader on the stage right now, arguably the most isolated in Chinese history, and he's now more shut off from everything and all sources of information than even the Kim dynasty of North Korea. And so we are seeing catastrophic policy decisions being made in economics and trade with COVID and security.
And all of this, contrary to Dalio's ideas, is leading more and more analysts to think that China could not surpass the US economy and create a new world order. Agreeing with Warren Buffett and George Soros, the first because he has always ruled out the United States losing its dominant position at an economic level, and the second because of the responsibility that Xi Jinping would have, deviating from Deng Xiaoping's model and causing the loss of course from China. But remember, you are the one who must decide what to do with your money with the information available. Do you trust China enough to invest in this country? Do you think Luis Martínez was wrong in his research? Tell us in the comments. I would like to know your opinion. Until next time.